just assume this is probably like it's a soft NS.
Yeah. I mean,
Not safe for work. WF.
right. It's on the
FW.
internet. It's on the internet.
It's not. It's on the internet. Fuck it. Whatever. Don't let your kids watch Talking TouchDesigner. All right. Um. Yeah, man. All right. So you got a bunch of Python stuff to talk about.
Got a ton of Python.
Woo. Woo goodies. And there are there are so many things that people added here to this list about like what they want to see and what they want to talk about. So just to kind of like run through some of them here. I know that Richard wants us to talk about our worst shenanigans on the road, and I might take a soft pass on that one. I could probably hit at a few of the unfortunate situations that have occurred, but I'm gonna probably just give a soft whiff on that one personally. Yeah. Sorry, Richard. I owe you a beer. But I know there's some questions about sensors in here. There are some questions about building out Q sets and thinking about how all that bit works, which is good and interesting, which I think has got some pretty solid tiebacks to some of the other stuff that I've seen people ask these days, especially about how you think about storing parameters or presets externally and you get them in and out and all that good stuff. And that's a bit of Python, but that's often pretty helpful stuff to kind of tackle.
Yeah, totally.
And then what else?
There's some pixel mapping.
Yeah.
Which starts to get into like Chopland a little bit. Mm-hmm. Reusable components. How can we make things that like we can keep reusing and editing and they're useful?
Yeah. 100%, 100%.
And then I also see some VR stuff as well.
Yeah, the VR stuff I think is, I don't know if do you have a VR rig set up?
I don't know. I do at the office, but it's tough for me to do anything like that here.
Yeah, same boat. It's like we have a couple rigs set up at Obscura, but I don't have one set up here because I don't. Well, I mean, I think it'd be interesting to hear some of your kind of like philosophical perspective on some of it, because I go back and forth on VR. I think it's really useful for previs content, and it's really useful for a lot of the stuff where you're trying to help people get a sense of what an experience is going to be. But especially the kind of scale of work that Obscura is doing, it's hard for us to think about how we integrate that into an event or a show or an experience where there's supposed to be lots of people having the experience simultaneously. Mm-hmm. Because VR tends to be more kind of siloed in its consumption.
Yeah, I mean, it's tough to really get at that like group experience through VR. I know that we've done a bunch of work with VR domes and trying to give a group of people a VR experience, but it's tough to get like what the HTC Vive captures so well as like a group experience, you know? Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, I think that there's a lot of promise for VR in mid-size events, but the second you start getting up to like the scale that you guys are working on, it, you know, it
yeah.
becomes,
I mean, yeah. I think the silliest experience that we have is that we've set up rigs before, and I guess what we could talk about is we could talk about kind of some of the kind of pieces that go into building a VR situation, right? Because you've got a geometry, and you've got a light, right? It's like all the typical things that you would expect, but then you also you end up using two cameras because you need a right eye and a left eye. You've got to have this kind of like stereo situation set up for it. And I haven't set up one in a minute, so if I say something fucking crazy, you stop me for the
All
love of
right.
God.
Yeah.
But usually, I mean, it depends on which rig you're using. I know that the Oculus for sure actually gives you a transformation matrix
Hmm.
as an input, so you can actually just like plug that right into um, your transform. You can do your like pre-transform, and I forget which. Yeah, you got to turn your pre-transform on, and then you can dump in um, your matrix of transformation for your right eye and your left eye into your kind of camera rig here. And I'll split my view so we can kind of see that a little bit better. So right, because we don't have a rig here, we're just kind of faking it. You end up with like this kind of situation where it's right, left. You got to consider where the convergence is, which is like a whole nother misery.
Hmm.
And then I don't know what you do, but I typically like to add a null
Oh yeah.
to my setups. Um, and if you parent both of your cameras to your null, you get a nice jig to be able to do like a complete transform for your rig.
The only time
Um,
that like bites is when you have a look at. Um,
oh yeah,
so you can like start to get those cameras sideways, and that I've run into problems with stereo rigs in that. But I think that if you structure your scenes, in a smart way, you can eliminate that problem.
yeah. I think one of the things that's really exciting in rendering land is, I mean, I've got a 980 in this machine, so it's not going to be um, the right kind of setup here. But if you've got a render top situation on a Pascal card, you can actually render both cameras in a single pass. And I forget how you set that
Oh,
up. Oh, it's right there. You do this. Is that one pass per camera? X offset. It's one of those duders in there, and you get way better performance. You end up with you're able to render the scene in one pass on your GPU rather than having to do a pass per eye.
that's nice.
Um, yeah, it's really nice, and that's like that's great um, for VR stuff, and you use like a render select to be able to get out that other eye, right? And we do like camera 1, and we got to be at buffer 0. Um, but it's a huge advantage for situations where you need multiple renders. Say like you're doing some projection mapping, and your projectors are looking at different portions of your model. They're pretty great performance enhancements there as well, which is pretty slick,
I
pretty
mean,
really slick.
I personally think that the best way to break into VR is to just use the palette browser stuff. Like if you're really curious about how to use HTC Vive or Oculus, like there's some really great things already built in the palette
Yeah.
around that kind of stuff.
And Jared's done like a pretty amazing job of putting together that whole like starting point, um, both doc and tow file. And I think it's on the. I know I've seen it in the wiki. I know it's on the forum, but it's a pretty amazing starting point that not only sets up your environment so you can be in it, but also creates a virtual representation of touch, so you don't even have to leave the headset to keep programming.
Yeah.
So like you, that's the place I would start these days,
Mhm.
as it's hard enough to kind of dig in once you start to get really into it. So you might as well give yourself the benefit of having a place to get started without being in the weeds right away.
Right. Right.
I think
Yeah.
you know.
I mean, the last thing you want to do is go cross-eyed trying to figure out stereo.
Been there, done that.
Yeah, seriously.
Uh, that's a misery in many ways. Um, but yeah, so that's, again, the kind of principle, right? If we were going to talk about like how we think about the principle of these things, it's really that you've got two cameras that represent your right eye and left eye, and then you would end up using that for your Oculus, right? You've got a right eye, left eye input into this, um, and then that ends up going out to your device, and it's going to tell me I don't have a device, so I can't do it. But if you did, that's how you kind of set it up, and is really useful. And if you get this like render timing, latency timing, you get lots of really cool flags to get there. One gotcha I would bring up, because it has foiled us more than once, and I know it's foiled other folks more than once, is that I know the Oculus has got like a 75 hertz refresh rate.
Yeah, it's faster than a monitor or a normal
Yeah.
monitor.
And the Vive is like 90 or something like that, isn't it?
Yeah, I think the Vive is faster.
Um, and so what we usually do is right, you got to like set this like frame counter down here. You got to turn that up to 90. But then you're going to be bound. In my case, I'm locked to the refresh rate of my monitor. So what that ends up looking like is we'll go into perform mode, but what we'll do is we'll actually flip this little switch in here that says draw window. And then once that's flipped off, when you're in perform mode, you're only outputting to your device, and you're not outputting to your main display anymore. So your refresh rate will go up. And that's actually, I know that for anyone that's seen the kind of like crazy Vive tracking stuff that Harvey's been doing, it's some of the same idea. And I can actually show what that looks like a little bit here. So like he was wanting to track at 120 hertz. And if I drop down a perform chop, and I got my refresh rate, and if I touch out, and then I'm going to go ahead and fire up another instance. So like all of this malarkey really is just kind of like to demonstrate what's going on here. So I'm just going to go ahead and do some setup here. And we got to touch in on this side. And with any luck, that'll, great, wonderful. Okay, so we're still stuck here at 60, which is about what we'd expect. But if we go into perform mode on this side, you'll see that we have a window that's not refreshing, but we're actually running at 120, because that's what I set the project to run at. And that's a great trick anytime you have some process that needs to go slower, or excuse me, faster than the refresh rate of your monitor, is to disable that disable the draw of your perform window, and then you're not bound by whatever's happening in graphics land.
Sure, that's a great tip. I didn't actually know that. That's perfect.
There you go.
Yeah,
pro tip.
That's awesome.
Taking
that note.
I mean, we've even gone so far in the past to like set up. We'll use like a keyboard in DAT or CHOP, and we'll use hotkeys or key commands to be able to disable or enable that. So that gives you some nice ways to be able to kind of still interact with, you can still open up a control panel and change some settings and put it back into high performance mode. Mm-hmm. And so that's, that's a good tricksy one there for you.
Yeah, it's an awesome tip. That just starts running everything faster. I mean, like I've done so many of these networks where like I'll just externalize a script just to get it to run on a different thread or faster than TouchDesigner will run it at. So like if I could start throwing them into another TouchDesigner instance, that has some added benefits too.
Yeah. I mean, there's some really goofy, fun stuff there. And I'm trying to remember where I have this tucked away. But I think it's in, pardon me while we do some spelunking. but I think it's in this TDFB business, and I got to do a pull real fast. But I did actually set up in here, I think this vars at start example has got an example in here of how you can use your, oh my goodness. Oh, heavens, let's hope everything in there was okay. So in this thing is just a nice little kind of boilerplate example of how you can use a batch script, or in this case, a CMD, to actually launch multiple instances of touch from the command line. So like this one is really kind of focused on how you can get variables into touch. And I don't know if you've done this yet, but it's a really slick way to get to some fun stuff, because you can actually pass in environment variables when you start touch if you use a command line script like this.
Oh, cool.
So you end up setting your role here first, and then you can take or leave this timeout business, and then you start your application, and then you point it at a tow file, and then I'm going to do the same thing with the same tow file, but I'm going to pass in a different what do you call it, environment variable.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm going to go ahead and close these things, and we'll fire it up so we can see what that looks like. Oops. Because that, the place where that gets really handy is especially in the realm of GPU affinity and any of the kind of situations where you want to have one tow file but give it multiple IDs.
Yeah, I was actually just reading about the GPU affinity yesterday, and the arguments that you can pass in for that. It's pretty fascinating. I didn't know that you could set environment variables in this way too.
Exactly. So you can see here, actually, right, we've got two instances running. I've got one running as node. I've got one running as controller.
Mm-hmm.
And if we dig in here, we'll see that this is actually fetching this me.var role, which if we go back to our command line script here, we'll see, right, role is controller. That's where we set that up there. And similarly, node is happening over here. And there's some other like goofy stuff. We're working on some really fun stuff at Obscura that's like, it's so in the weeds, but it's like really fun for folks that are working on crazy big kind of installations. Anyway, so the benefit here means that you're able to use a similar approach that you might on a distributed system, right? Because some of the solutions that we've worked up in the past at Obscura have been to use host name or to use IP address as ways to figure out how a machine should configure itself at start. We ran into a couple hurdles with what that's looked like at some installations, so we moved away from that and instead have been using a Python, or a JSON sidecar file that sits in the root directory of the project. And that file gets checked on start, and whatever that file tells the machine to be is what it starts up as. But that doesn't work if
you change that JSON sidecar out for each project?
Yeah, okay. And you change it out for each machine. Mm-hmm. I mean, the goofy thing that I've been working on lately is a way to be able to, like, let's say that you don't have the file in the root of your directory. When you fire your machine up, it should just do something like ask you, hey, I don't have an assigned role. What would you like me to be right now? Which means that you can just kind of like keep launching it and keep assigning roles, which is a great way to be able to run a controller in one instance and run an output in another instance. Mm-hmm. And then the other kind of wrinkle in that is that we've sorted out a situation where the master controller for a given installation has a little heartbeat check-in with all of the nodes, and then you're able to issue roles remotely. So I can be like, oh, hey, this machine, I want you to be this role. This machine, I want you to be that role. This other machine, I want you to be that role. And we can kind of do all that on the fly,
Yeah.
Which is slick. But you need a way to be able to do that from the command line if you want to say, fire up a project and send it to 2 different GPUs on the same machine. And so this solution gets you there.
Yeah, that's really slick. I'm gonna have to check that out. Environment variable. That's really slick.
The gotcha I would advise folks to keep in mind is that this CMD or batch file that you make, you have to right-click Run as Administrator. If you don't run it as an administrator, you don't set those environment variables. And it had me scratching my head for, I can't tell you how many hours, an embarrassing number of hours.
I had a very similar experience with the Surface keyboard. We run a lot of stuff like brand ambassadors consoles through Microsoft Surfaces, and the keyboard that pops up for the Surface doesn't have a proper API through Windows.
Oh, bother.
And in order to actually run it, you need to run as administrator the entire TouchDesigner network. So, yeah, no, that sucks. But I had a very similar 3 days of frustration of
3-day detour.
That's right.
The one other kind of like nerdy thing I'll throw in here for folks that are really interested in kind of thinking about some bigger problems and how you kind of dig into some bigger problems. Part of the reason we were exploring a lot of this environment variable kind of variation was that we have an in-house tool that's a monitoring tool that's able to start our applications, rescue them if they fail, all those things. I know Envoid has an app that they made called Stalker that does a similar thing, and then there's a couple more out there that are for free, that are open source. The wrinkle for us is that it's not uncommon that we might have a touch kind of tow file, right, that's running a bunch of visuals, but we might also be running something in Node.js or something in Max, right? So there are kind of like layers of things that are kind of working together to keep everything kind of humming along. And one of the challenges in that is that you end up with a bunch of different apps that are all working in concert, and then all of your different apps end up maintaining their own log files. So then when you're trying to troubleshoot something, you've got to check logs in, sometimes 2 or 3 different places to try and eventually track down what went wrong. Well, it turns out if you're into, if C++ is your wheelhouse, the tricksy thing you can do is you can actually open a named pipe, and you can pass your data through a named pipe with with Python, and treat that as a logging tool.
That's nice.
So we actually, we run our monitoring service tool, and now we're able to connect to one big log file, and it just kind of will append everything inside of it. So any app that has a problem, all of its bits and bobs get logged in the same place, which makes debugging a much easier endeavor.
How is the pipe opened?
So
is that like a Python module?
So the named pipe happens over on the monitoring service side.
Okay.
And then what happens is that passes in or we use the same trick once we figured out how to do environment variables, to pass in an environment variable that has the name of the pipe. Nice. So then we treat it just like it's a file. We open it as a write-only file. Yeah. The trick is from an efficiency standpoint, it's more efficient to leave the pipe open than to constantly open and close it. if you're wanting to write to it as a log file. So you got to open it and then stick that object into storage, because then you don't have to close the pipe.
So
Um,
why? Actually, so I have a similar thing. I'm not as C++ inclined. However, I've run into the fact that like I'm running, a bunch of computers and a bunch of different instances and a bunch of different software all at once that all need to log back to a similar, like one file or one type of data structure. And I've done Mongo. Like I've
oh
spun up
yeah.
a Mongo database on a local machine, had everybody connect back to that Mongo database through PyMongo, and set my logger to have a switch, like a toggle on the container level that's like, use Mongo or don't use Mongo for this project. And if you use Mongo for the project, it'll try to connect and spit database files, or sorry, database documents into a database called log, which you can then parse by date or event, or you can get right into the console and be like, hey, I'm looking for all the warnings that happened on Thursday, or whatever it might be. Like how many times did this machine restart on this day? Does that give me any clue?
That's awesome.
Yeah, the parsing tool, like as much gripe as I have about Mongo being like kind of an insecure database tool, like for logging, especially something that like is never going to be open to the internet, it's pretty nice.
That's super slick. I'm supposed to report to you from Isabel that you are a little quiet.
Oh,
So if you can bump up your levels at all.
all right, let's try that.
You know,
Let's.
it's
I bet you it's just the microphone's a little far away.
I
How's
know
that?
that I oh well, we'll see. We'll get a report back
All
shortly, I
right,
bet.
all right.
I mean, I know that logging isn't a particularly exciting topic.
What are you talking
Um,
about? Logging is so much fun.
But it is, I mean, as I'm sure you know, anyone that's worked on a big installation or a big project, any project that you don't get to babysit, um, it's such an invaluable measure for being able to figure out what on earth is going on when it quits for no reason, or your client tells you that it restarts erratically, but they can't give you a report about what circumstances make that happen. And it's well worth the time to sort out what it is that you need from a logging point of view, and then dig in a little bit.
Yeah, especially when you start getting into multiple machines, like that just becomes a pain in the neck to try to sort out.
Yeah, 100%. Isabel says a little bit more.
A little bit more. All right. Oh man. Let's see here.
The other goodie that I would point out to folks, and I only bring this one up because I've had a couple people that I've talked to that didn't even know this existed, is that there is a perform DAT, just like there's a perform chop. And this perform DAT, if you could either pulse it or you can active it. You can flip your active toggle. But what you end up with here is essentially the same kind of stuff that you get out of the activity monitor or the performance monitor. What do you call this? Doodad. Our I forget what it's called. All of a sudden, why? Window placement. Yeah, our performance monitor. So, just like we use this thing to kind of debug what's going on in a project all the time, there's a DAT that gives you all that same information about, the ID of the object, the info that it's reporting, where it is, when it started, when it stopped it, what its warning level is, what its cook time is. And so one of the things that I built into that like goofy little logger that I made was the ability to um, tell your project to log a perform um, file. So just like take this whole thing and spit it into a CSV. So like your project hits some kind of performance threshold, all of a sudden you're at 12 frames a second. Let's take a snapshot of what's going on, because then you're able to actually trace back to what's costing you time and cycles. So yeah, there you go.
That's pretty smart. I love that actually. Just take a snapshot of that DAT and like tell me what's going on later when I wake up or when I get that text message.
Right? Because it's, just like with the activity monitor, what you end up wanting to know is you want to know, what on earth, what op is the thing that was cooking that was taking 12 milliseconds? And, if you've ever pulled your hair out trying to track something down, this kind of snapshot is a real easy way to get there. Yeah. And with something like Mongo, right, it's not a big stretch to think about how you spit out a CSV and then build a dashboard to be able to visualize that remotely.
Yeah, totally. I mean, you can have some kind of service running in the background that's just like your dashboard for the installation that's going on. Absolutely. I mean, if only there were enough time in the day, right?
Yeah, right, exactly. Anyway, so that's some of that goofy stuff. You got some Python though, so tell us some stories about Python that's making you excited these days.
Oh man, I have so much. Let me see here. So, let me dig into a file here. So recently I've been working on a project that's needed the ability to load files up, movie files up on demand in a big way, and like this is something that we do a lot of in TouchDesigner. However, this project, the way I approached it was having. Hold on, Matt. Can you see my screen?
I can't, but if you'd share it with me, it'd really be swell.
Yeah, you got it. Hold on. Share screen. There we go.
Ooh,
right. Yeah, right?
Sassy.
We're somewhere else now. Where was I? Oh, so essentially this project, things are loaded up into tox files that's on an A/B deck with toxes. So we have a scene that a tox file is loaded up into A deck, and then the next one is going to be loaded up into a B deck, and back and forth and back and forth. These tox files have in them a bunch of different movie file ins, but when you load those things up on demand, you can choke the system out, right? Like loading up a movie file with the tox starts to right. You just performance.
Go.
Exactly. So what you want to do in those situations is actually select out to wherever your movie file is. In this case, I threw mine in this component called base assets. And in base assets, we have a number of decks, right? And these decks all have within them a movie file represented here as a text file, just to have differing content between all of them. So these decks that hold my content, I only have a limited number of them. I can only play so many movie files at a time based on the requirement of my hardware. So what I built out for this project was a way to allocate decks on the fly. So as I load up a base, it actually asks assets, can I allocate this many decks? Can I have this many movie files that I can play back? And if it can, it plays back the file. If it can't, it logs an error. So I know that we have to find another way to optimize that. just for the bottleneck of hardware. So what I built out here, and I can show you how this whole system works right here, is a tricksy way of working in Python. Not really tricksy. It's actually kind of Pythonic. We have an object, a class definition called deck. And deck basically just stores a bunch of information about the comp that is defined in TouchDesigner. So at the top of when this component base assets is loaded, initialized, it looks for how many decks there are. In this case, there's 4. So it then creates that many decks, right? We can define an object in the same module. So I have class deck. It looks for, with this line of Python, it looks for all of the decks that are in that module, and it reports, I've found this many decks, blah, blah, blah. And then it creates one of those virtual decks, one of these class decks for each one of those comps, and appends it to a list. So now memory manager, this object memory manager, knows how many decks it has available to allocate. And then the only other thing that this object up here does, this secondary class, is it has 2 functions, allocate and deallocate. And this basically allows a deck to know if it's being used or it's not being used at any given time. So we have this function down here in the memory manager, which allows us to allocate a certain number of decks, right? So we start when an object like back here, sorry, in base core, when base A requests a number of objects, in this case 2 objects, select 1 and select 2, it looks to see how many decks are currently not allocated, right? We have this list comprehension right here, which is essentially, for every deck in the list of decks that we've accumulated, give me all of the decks that aren't allocated. And so not allocated becomes a list of decks that are currently available to be used and loaded from. And then we send those back to the base A object to load from there. And then once base A is done with those, once it's unloaded, it actually deallocates them again. And there's something that I discovered that TouchDesigner, like I knew a bunch of Python going into learning TouchDesigner, but I didn't realize how thoroughly like all of Python is implemented within TouchDesigner. The internal, like the built-in definition delete is what's called just before this element is deleted. So you can, if you unload an object from TouchDesigner, this def delete gets called just before it's unloaded, just before any component is deleted or anything like that. This definition is called. So in this, I deallocate all of the decks that I'm using so they can be reused in another tox file when it's loaded up.
Smart, so smart.
Right. I mean, it's and you can implement this with render decks. You can implement this with caches. You can implement this with movie file ins. It's really like something that I've been playing around with a lot recently, and I can give you a kind of an example of this, I guess, of how this whole system works, and I can post this specific example up later too, so people can poke around in how it's working. But if I were to open up my text port, you can see that when this file was loaded, we found 4 decks. And that's essentially this base assets component reporting in that it's found 4 decks that we can use. And it saved them. It now has them as these deck objects that are an external definition. Another class definition. So when something requests decks, if I were to if I were to for instance, delete this thing, right? There are now 4 decks that we can use. There are now 4 decks available. And let's say I have a base that's empty right now, but I load it with one of these external toxes, so base element 1, which requests 2 decks, and I init that network. Inside of here is now 2 of these selects, which access the null final, the final output from those decks. And that all happens on the fly the second that tox is loaded. Right? So
slick. That's really slick.
let's say I open up another base, right? I have another base that loads that the second base element, and I re-init that. That guy only has 1 select in it, and it selects the next one in line, right? So from there, what you could do is, let's say, have a table in this DAT that acts as a content map. So you could look up based on how many selects are in the file, right? You could look up what top do they go to. So this one would go to select 1, and then what's the path to it? So you know, for example, C blah 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 blah, right? I don't know where that movie file is. But
yes, that's for good.
But when these things get loaded, right, in this element, it searches. It does that same search, parent.ops select. Look for all the selects in the file, allocate a number of them, and then go through and set the parameter for the top that they look at to the output path, right? You could also, in that moment, you could say, okay, self, what would that be? That would be, so d.load, right? If that deck in the allocated deck in the base assets has a function called load, where you can load up a movie file, you could then look up that table definition and preload this content when the tox is loaded.
Oh my goodness, that's pretty slick. Is what that is.
Oh yeah, like loving this whole setup, and it you know, all the optimization that comes with it is priceless. You know, having movie files, all like these movie file ins that are already there and have a definition for how they get loaded, how they get unloaded, caching the memory, all of that stuff already just sitting in the network and you know, preloaded when the TouchDesigner file opens up. It's just so much quicker than loading those movie files on demand, you know.
That's great. Have you, all right, so like living in this same kind of exploration, it seems like you're going to be terrifying once you start to work with internal parameters. Have you like played with that at all?
Internal parameters.
Oof. Oh dear. So check it out. This like
Yeah, hold on. Let me switch us back over here. Let's switch the modes.
All right, we'll see if I can actually set up one of these quick. I'm gonna have to look up an example. Internal parameters. This is a Greg special. And it's one of the things that is, from the outside, it feels like, maybe I don't need that. Um, but the
Those are always the
truth
most
is,
exciting.
once you get a handle on it, it it will revolutionize the way that you work. Um, so let's say that I've got a base here, and this is I don't know, my great talks, right? And this has got all sorts of like goodies in it. And one of the things that I want to be able to do is I want all the advantages of extensions, right? But I don't necessarily want to set up a big juicy Python pipeline, um, just because just to like move around a few values. So what you can do instead is you could do one of these goodies. So we're going to put another base in here, and we're just going to call this pars. And we'll go ahead and we'll customize this doodad. I'm just going to add a page called test. And we'll make an Ian special. That's I will just like let it be a one-dimensional float here. Great. And we'll make a mat special. Same deal. Okay, great. And just like we would expect with custom parameters, right, we've got those goodies right there. Now, if I want to change those, right, I'd have to do something like this. So I've got a text add here. I'd have to be like, all right, so the operator that's base my great talks, and then I forgot already what that's called, base pars, and story of my life, base pars, and then I need to get to the par called the Ian special. Pretty sure that's all lowercase. Yep. Okay, and then maybe I want to set that to be 1. Jesus. All right, so we could run that, and with any luck, okay.
Woohoo!
Yeah! Okay, well, the only downfall to that, right, the only bummer is that this path is really important. So we could give it a global op shortcut. We got lots of ways we could get to that thing. But wouldn't it be just dandy if instead I could say, you know what I want to do is I want to use the op inside of here called base pars, and I want to grab all the pars for that, and I'm going to call it goodies, because why not? And we'll promote that.
Shut up.
Right, you can see where this is going all of a sudden. Is that now, well, we could add an eval here, and I got to init this. I should be able to use this stuff. I should be able to say the op base my great talks ext goodies, and then I should be able to just grab the Ian special, and there it is.
No. That's
so then
brilliant.
like, the thing that's really great and like goofy about that, and one of the places that becomes extremely powerful is that you get all of the benefits of traditional parameters accessible as extensions. So you could say reset to defaults, or you could find out what the max value val is, or the min val, or you name it.
Wow.
Right?
I love
And then
that.
inside, right? So inside of here, you could use your parameter chop, and I could just grab my customs. I'll plug in a null. So then I can export from this goodie to whatever, but now I've effectively set up an extension without having to write any Python.
Oh, that's spectacular.
It's got so much potential, especially when you think about what pars can be, because they could be ops, they could be strings, they can be floats, they can be multi-dimensional floats, right? So you've got all sorts of kind of options that still live within the TouchDesigner framework um, that save you the headache of setting up the extension to have an object that you're going to instantiate on start that's going to represent this value, that has a reset value, that whatever. It's huge.
Yeah,
It's really huge.
I dig that. That's I'm gonna have to definitely start using that. I love the I didn't realize that. I mean, it makes sense now thinking about it, but you could use any module in that extension.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
That's sweet.
So that's, yeah. I mean, and even better still, right, is this has got like if you've ever done any of the misery that is dependencies, right, this has got some dependencies that are already baked into it for
Mm-hmm.
you because it shows up, it's a parameter, but it's also an extension.
That's
So
oh, that's super nice.
yeah, that's like, there's all sorts of really slick and exciting ways to extend some of your kind of traditional workflow with that approach.
Hi folks, Ian here. Sorry for the technical difficulties. Unfortunately, my computer decided to stop recording after that segment of the stream, so we don't have any more of the stream from the other night to show you. Apologies again. Thank you so much for watching.